In the dark nights, when the moon's light is only enough to draw dim silhouettes, scary stories begin to creep into people's minds. Haunting memories, horrifying images, and screams echoing in the dark night all wait to be told. Prepare yourself, because these stories will take you on a journey filled with fear, where the unexplainable will keep you from sleeping. Do you have the courage to face your deepest fears? Story 1. In 2005, on a remote farm, a young woman lived with her elderly grandmother. Their house is isolated in the middle of a large field, surrounded only by dense forests and rolling hills. During the day, the house is still filled with sunlight, but when night falls, darkness swallows everything, making the space cold and creepy. One evening, after taking care of her grandmother all day, the young woman decided to rest a bit. She lay down on the sofa in the living room, leaving the house in the absolute silence of the night. The sound of wind whistling through the cracks in the door and the sound of insects chirping from afar echoed, creating a gloomy scene. The girl gradually fell asleep, unaware that a terrible nightmare was waiting for her. Around midnight, a scream tore through the night, waking her from her deep sleep. The scream rang out from her grandmother's room, loud and panicked, as if coming from her deepest nightmares. Panicked, the girl rushed towards her room. When she entered, she saw a horrifying scene. Her grandmother was cowering under the bedsheet, her body shaking, her mouth stuttering incoherent words. The young woman quickly ran to her side, grabbed her shoulder tightly, and shook her vigorously to attract attention. Grandma finally stopped shaking, her eyes widening in utter horror. Her breathing was panting, as if she had just escaped from a terrible nightmare. As she gradually regained her composure, her trembling voice began to recount what she had witnessed. She said that, as she was lying in the dark, she suddenly felt a strange presence in the room. At first, she thought that maybe she was just imagining things, but then she saw a figure standing at the door of the room. That figure was as red as blood, large and fierce. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, like flames burning everything around. It didn't say anything, just stood there, staring at her with eyes full of malice. In that moment, she knew she was facing something out of this world. Grandmother, with extreme fear, could not utter a word. She could only stare at that terrible shadow. Then, when her panic reached its peak, she realized that the figure was none other than Grandma Satan. She had never hallucinated in her life, but she insisted that what she saw was real. After telling the story, the grandmother still could not escape the obsession from that image, and the young woman, even though she did not see the other person's shadow, the cold feeling from her grandmother's story made her never stop. Now I can forget that terrible night. The two lived in fear, not knowing whether the red shadow would return or not, and if so, what it would bring this time. Story 2. On a gloomy morning in late autumn, Maria, a 67-year-old retired teacher, walked into the hospital with tired eyes and a worried expression. For the past few weeks, she has not been able to sleep peacefully. Every time she closed her eyes, strange and horrifying images appeared, causing her to wake up in the middle of the night with her heart pounding. Not only when she closed her eyes, even in the daytime moments, when she was reading a book or walking around the garden, creepy faces seemed to float before her eyes, smiling ghostly. The faces Maria saw were unlike anything she had ever known. They had big, pointy ears, teeth as sharp as blades, and glaring eyes that seemed to pierce her mind. The strange thing is that those faces are not round, but elongated horizontally, like the shape of a soccer ball, twisted and distorted to the point of being unforgettable. Maria tried to keep this a secret, but her fear grew more and more, to the point where she could no longer hide it. Her family, seeing that she was constantly in a state of panic, decided to take her to the hospital for a checkup. Maria was not crazy, but the extreme worry on her face made everyone feel concerned. Doctors immediately conducted tests, but the results did not show any signs of physical abnormalities. They ruled out infection, drug-induced hallucinations, and any illness that could cause the condition. However, that does not reduce Maria's obsession. In fact, when her family witnessed the nightmares she was suffering, they became even more worried. So much so that, before taking her to the hospital, they contacted a local priest, who was known for his exorcism abilities, to ask about performing an exorcism. Even though I tried many methods, from praying to meditating, the scary faces continued to appear. When Maria drew images of what she had seen, the lines on the paper clearly expressed the horror she had experienced. Faces with cold eyes, sharp teeth like monsters from hell, and scary long pointed ears appeared clearly. They were not just fleeting images, but as if they wanted to attack and take over her mind. After many days of research and discussion, doctors finally determined that Maria suffered from a rare syndrome called Charles Bonnet syndrome. This syndrome causes vivid visual hallucinations, often appearing in older people with impaired vision. These hallucinations are not just random images, but are often bizarre and terrifying sights, from small dancing people to strangely shaped animals or haunted, distorted faces. The special thing about these hallucinations is that they only appear visually, without accompanying sound, making the experiencer feel even more isolated and afraid. Even though she clearly understood the disease she had, Maria could not erase the horrifying images she had seen. Every time she closed her eyes, those faces appeared, reminding her of the obsession she could not escape. Her later days were a never-ending battle with the ghosts of her mind, a war she knew she could never win. Those terrifying faces will forever pursue her, becoming an inseparable darkness from her life, making each passing day an inconsolable obsession. Story 3. In 1995, Tomac Arrieta, a middle-aged man, had just experienced the most painful loss of his life. His mother, the only remaining member of his small family, passed away after a long and painful battle with cancer. Her passing left Tomac with a huge and endless void in his soul. He no longer had the motivation to continue living, and instead locked himself in his bedroom, locked in his unrelenting pain. In the small, narrow room, light only glimmered through the closed curtains. In the days after his mother passed away, Tomac was completely immersed in sadness, not leaving his bed, not eating, not talking to anyone. He seemed to be caught in a vortex of despair and suffering, with no way out. One night, when fatigue finally caused him to fall asleep, Tomac suddenly woke up. At first, he thought he was still dreaming, but then the clear sound of the doorbell rang out in the terrifyingly quiet space of the house. It was not an ordinary bell, but a long, haunting sound, as if someone was standing outside and repeatedly ringing the bell with inexplicable patience. Tomac sat up, his heart beating rapidly in his chest. The house was silent, except for the creaking of the old wooden floor under his feet. He clearly felt the vibration of the floor, as if a great weight was pressing down on it, causing the wooden planks to crack and crackle in the darkness. Feeling uneasy rising in his heart, Tomac slowly raised his head and looked towards the door. He almost stopped breathing when he saw his mother standing there, right in the doorway, her face as white as wax, her eyes wide open but lifeless, staring at him. She was wearing the clothes he had personally chosen for her on the day of the funeral, but now they looked as wrinkled and cold as the person wearing them. Her eyes were empty, no longer the warmth of the mother he once knew, replaced by a cold, scary look as if returning from the underworld. Tomac wanted to scream, but the scream was choked in his throat. He tried to stand up, but his legs were frozen and he couldn't move. His mother didn't say anything, just stood there, silent and motionless, but her presence made the whole room feel like it was covered with a cold air. Tomac finally screamed, a scream that tore through the air, filled with panic and pain, a scream loud enough to break the quiet night, echoing outside and startling the nearby neighbors awake. Neighbors, who knew Tomac had gone through great pain, immediately called the police when they heard that terrifying scream. When the police arrived, they found Tomac cowering in the corner of the room, his eyes lost and extremely panicked. He kept muttering about seeing his mother. She was standing right in front of the door. She was looking at him. But when police checked the house, there was no sign that anyone other than Tomek was there. After being taken to the hospital, doctors conducted a series of tests, but did not find any signs of abnormalities in Tomek's body or mind that could cause hallucinations. For all they knew, Tomek was perfectly healthy, at least physically. But the fear he experienced, the terror of facing his mother's ghost, was indelible. Since that night, Tomek never returned to his old house. He gave up everything, moved to a strange place, trying to forget what happened. But every time he closed his eyes, the image of his mother standing in the doorway, her white face and lifeless eyes, appeared, haunting him in every dream. The ghosts of the past never let Tomek go, and he knows that no matter how far he runs, he cannot escape that haunting. Story 4. When I was young, my mother was a single mother who spent all day working and only had time to take care of me in the evening. Every night, before going to bed, she always comes to check on me, bending over the bed to wish me good night. She is my only support, the light in the long, dark nights. One night, while I was sleeping, I was suddenly awakened by a strange sound. In the dim darkness of the room, I heard a rustling sound coming from the wardrobe in the corner of the room. At first, I thought I was just dreaming, but the sound was so clear that I couldn't ignore it. I opened my eyes, trying to adjust my vision in the darkness, and then I saw a familiar figure standing at the foot of the bed. That's my mother. She was smiling at me, waving gently as usual, telling me to go back to sleep. But something is not right. Instead of leaving the room after wishing me good night, my mother walked to the closet. She opened the closet door, just a crack enough to get in, then slowly closed it, but not completely. She stood there, just poking her head through the tiny gap in the cabinet, staring at me with her deep black eyes. She didn't say anything, just stood there, looking at me with a strange smile and eyes glowing in the dark. A chill spread throughout my body, but I was too young and too naive to understand what was happening. I pulled the blanket up to cover my head, tried to ignore that scary image, and finally fell asleep. The next morning, as I sat down to breakfast, the image of the night before still haunted my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about what happened, and finally I decided to ask my mother about it. I asked her why she hid in the closet last night and looked at me through the gap. My mother, who was always calm, suddenly stopped mid-movement, her eyes clearly showing confusion and worry. She stared at me, as if trying to determine whether I was joking or not. Finally, with a serious voice, she told me that she did not come into my room last night and that she did not even wake up during the night. In that moment, fear and insecurity rose in my heart like a fierce wave. If my mother wasn't in the room that night, then who was standing at the end of my bed? Who entered the closet and looked at me through the crack? A feeling of horror spread throughout my body as I realized that last night's image could not be my mother. But the scariest thing was that I couldn't determine who or what it was. Even though my mother tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just a dream or a hallucination caused by fatigue, I could never forget those deep black eyes and that cold smile. That image was engraved deeply into my mind, becoming an obsession that I could not escape. Although I would later experience only 2 other hallucinations, none could compare to the horror I experienced that night. That story still haunts me to this day, and every time I think about it, I can't help but wonder, was it really just a hallucination? Or was there something else, more terrifying, happened in that room on that fateful night? Story 5. When I was 13 years old, I never had sleep problems. I am usually a very deep sleeper, without dreams or startles. But one Saturday morning, after going to bed late the night before, I woke up unable to move. I clearly felt paralysis spread throughout my body. The only thing I could control were my eyes. The weak light from the window shines into the room, making the space blurry. the boundary between reality and virtuality becomes thin. As I tried to adjust my vision, I realized I was looking towards the corner of the bed. And then I saw the most horrifying thing I've ever seen in my life: a tall man, at least 8 feet tall, standing there. His face was terrifying, with a wide mouth and blood remaining on his sharp teeth. He was wearing black, dirty clothes, but what scared me the most were his hands. He was holding a large carving knife, the steel of the blade glinting in the dim light. Extreme fear took over me as he started to move towards me, but strangely he didn't move. He seemed to glide through the air, his feet never touching the ground, his hand hovering beside him like a ghost. I wanted to scream, want to run away, but my whole body seemed frozen, unable to move even a little. He came closer, to the edge of my bed, and for the first time I saw his arm lift, the knife glinting in the dim light. He raised the knife high, pointed it at the ceiling, and I knew what was about to happen. I couldn't do anything but close my eyes tightly, waiting for that terrible thing to happen. But after about 30 seconds, I still didn't feel anything. My heart pounded loudly in my chest, and curiosity overcame fear. I slowly opened my eyes, and the horrifying image was gone. That man disappeared. There was no trace left in the room. Suddenly, I realized I could move again. I jumped up, ran straight out of the room, explaining everything to my parents in a panic. They immediately understood and explained that I had just experienced sleep paralysis, a phenomenon I had never heard of before. But no matter how they explained, I still couldn't forget that fear, and the image of that man's scary face still haunts me to this day. Story 6. As a single mother, I have to work 2 jobs to support my 3-year-old son. This forced me to hire a regular babysitter, and many nights I drove long distances to my second job, so exhausted that I almost fell asleep behind the wheel. Sometimes I try to stay awake by pinching my arm, shaking my head, or even lightly slapping my face, but it all seems to be in vain. The highway I was driving on had no lights, just thick darkness that swallowed everything around. That night, as sleepiness began to creep in, I heard a strange sound, a soft giggle coming from behind me. I was startled, filled with anxiety, eyes glued to the rearview mirror. To my surprise and panic, my 3-year-old son was sitting in the back seat, looking straight at me through the mirror. My heart seemed to stop beating. I immediately stepped on the brake. The car stopped in an instant. I turned around and looked straight at the back seat. But that row of seats was empty. There was no one there. 10 seconds later, my phone rang. As a babysitter, his voice shook as he said he had just fallen down the stairs and broken his ankle. In that moment, I was completely awake, with no more signs of sleepiness. I accelerated and drove home, my mind still in shock. To this day, I still believe that mothers have a special sixth sense for their children. That feeling, the sound of my son laughing from behind, and the phone call giving the bad news at the same time were all etched into my mind as a scary reminder of the invisible but strong bond between mother and child. Story 7. I have always loved my hometown, a peaceful place with neighbors close enough to feel safe. But in the heart of that place, the surrounding dark forests always made me feel uneasy. That night, like every other night, I was home alone. The sky was dark, and all the surrounding houses were asleep. Suddenly, a scream rang out from the woods, making me shiver. That scream was unlike any sound I had ever heard before, painful, blood-curdling, and seemingly coming from the depths of darkness. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I couldn't ignore it. I took the flashlight, went outside, and headed towards the backyard. Standing at the boundary between light and darkness, I shined my light through the dense trees. Everything was strangely silent, no wind, no insect sounds, only dense darkness surrounding. Then, for a moment, my light hit something. My heart stopped beating when I saw the outline of a tall creature, at least twice my height. It's not a person. The thing stood tall, with a long trunk, like an elephant's trunk, hanging from its face down to its waist. Its body was black, colorless, as if it were just a ghost. And the most terrifying thing was that it was moving, slowly and slowly towards me with a strange step. I stepped back, my steps shaking, my eyes still glued to that creature. When I entered the house and slammed the door, I looked through the window, but the creature had disappeared, as if it had never existed. Still, that scream and the terrifying appearance of what I saw still haunted me. Until now, I still sincerely hoped that it was all just my imagination. But deep inside, I knew that what I witnessed that night was real. Story 8. Late one night, while I was home alone, my sense of peace was shattered by a scream coming from the woods. The scream was not only a cry of pain, but also carried a desperate plea. Unable to sit still, I took a flashlight and walked out to the backyard, where the dense forest surrounded me. The atmosphere was so silent that I could hear the wind blowing through the leaves. The flashlight's light shined through the darkness, illuminating mysterious shapes among the trees. That's when I saw a tall shape looming among the trees. The distance from it to it was perhaps twice my height. My eyes couldn't believe what they saw. Something like a long tree trunk hung over its face, and its waist was vast, unlike any shape I had ever seen. It moved slowly, like a nightmare from old stories. The darkness surrounding it made it impossible for me to distinguish colors, leaving only indescribable darkness. Fear and confusion made me lose my reason. I stepped back into the house, my body trembling, and quickly closed the door. In a moment of panic, I looked out through the crack in the door. My flashlight seemed no longer strong enough to illuminate that thing. The strange figure had disappeared, as if it had never existed. Even though I tried to console myself that it was all just an illusion, its image still wouldn't leave my mind. I still hope that it's all just a product of my imagination, but the feeling of obsession and inexplicability still sticks with me. From that night on, the presence of that figure, with its terrible appearance and strange body parts, became a vivid nightmare that I cannot erase from my memory. Story 9. One summer not long ago, my family decided to spend the vacation at a resort deep in rural Pennsylvania. The scenery around the resort is very peaceful, with rolling hills and lush green forests. However, that quiet atmosphere carries an indescribable coldness, as if this place is not a place for young souls. Although this resort seems more suitable for older people, we still tried to enjoy the holidays by participating in the available activities. One afternoon, as I was walking around the resort, sunlight gently filtered through the foliage, creating a peaceful picture. I wandered near the main lodge, admiring the scenery and letting my mind drift with the wind. When I looked up, I suddenly saw a teenage girl standing by the second-floor window, staring down at me. She looked quite cute, and I instinctively waved. But she didn't respond, just stood there, silent and lifeless, her eyes piercing through me. I felt a little shiver, but thought that maybe she was just daydreaming. That whole day I felt depressed because there wasn't much to do. I decided to go to the small playground on campus and sit on the swings, trying to pass the time. But not long after, I saw that girl again. This time she stood further away, at the edge of the playground near the tree line, just standing there, looking at me without blinking. A strange feeling overcame me, but the emotions of a teenager made me stand up and walk towards her. I walked slowly, step by step, to shorten the distance between us. But as I got closer, I started to realize something was very wrong. Her face, which seemed cute at first, now appeared strange. Her eyes were lifeless, just two dark holes. Her mouth was not a smile, but a long, distorted line, as if it had been cruelly carved. A creepy feeling spread throughout my body, but I couldn't stop. I just kept moving forward. Just when I was almost there, she suddenly turned around and ran straight into the forest, running at a terrifying speed, as if being hunted by something invisible. I stood there, completely motionless, looking in the direction she disappeared. A series of questions rang out in my head, but there were no answers. Who is this girl? Why is she here? And why do I feel like this? During the remaining days at the resort, I did not see her again, but the image of that girl kept haunting me. The feeling that something was wrong, that there was something dark and mysterious surrounding her presence, made me uneasy. When we got in the car to head home, I tried to forget everything. But as the car started rolling through the remote roads, my heart sank as I looked out the window. Next to the roadside trees, I saw her. She stood there, looking straight at me through the car window, her soulless eyes never leaving my gaze, even though the car had passed. I felt the blood in my body freeze. An invisible fear gripped my mind. I asked my parents if they had seen her, but they only replied with surprise, "Who?" I had no words to say, just sat quietly, trying to accept that it was all just an illusion. But in my heart, I knew that that girl was not just a product of my imagination. She was there, and she looked at me. That image will forever haunt me, never fading. Story 10. My experience with sleep paralysis was not a pleasant one, but that night, when I was 19 years old, was one of the most terrifying experiences I have ever faced. As the morning light began to filter through the window curtains, I lay in bed in a state of complete stillness, feeling as if every muscle in my body was locked tight. My eyes, like the rising sun, were wide open looking at the ceiling, but I couldn't move even a finger. A feeling of numbness spread throughout my body, and that helplessness made me feel like I was about to sink into despair. In a panic, I saw that girl standing next to the wall. Her eyes were dark black holes. Her eyes were not just deep holes, but also looks that couldn't be described in words. The feeling of looking into those eyes was not like looking at a human being, but like looking into a dark, bottomless abyss. Calmness is impossible in this situation. The girl began to move, her steps long and strange, as if her legs were longer than a normal human could. She approached my bed without stopping, getting closer to me step by step. I wanted to scream, wanted to push her away, but my body didn't listen. She stepped closer, and once she was standing next to the bed, she put her arms around my neck. Fear pushed me into an almost unbearable state. The feeling of her arms around my neck, tight and not letting me breathe, made me feel like I was suffocating. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I could only feel each of my own heavy breaths. It seemed like each breath was becoming more difficult. I felt like I was dying, as if the air around me had been sucked dry, leaving only suffocation and despair. During the paralysis, I was completely awake. I clearly felt each passing moment, as if I were lying underwater, unable to breathe. I felt as if I was standing between life and death, and that little girl, with her dark eyes and tight hug, was the symbol of the despair I couldn't escape. When I tried to raise my hand, I hit myself in the face, trying to stimulate my body to get out of this state. Every stroke, every movement was my last attempt to find my freedom. When I could finally breathe again, it felt like I had escaped a deadly nightmare, but the image of that little girl, with her black eyes and suffocating hug, still wouldn't leave my mind. This experience was not only a nightmare, but also a feeling of pain and despair that only those who have experienced it can understand. That little girl is not just an image in a dream, but an indelible obsession, a part of the fear that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. As the dawn light began to filter through the trees, everything seemed to return to normal. But the scary images and strange sounds still linger in my mind, like ghosts that never leave. These stories are not just bad dreams, but also vivid memories, obsessions that we cannot erase. Can you believe that these things can happen in real life? Be careful, because maybe one night, those fears will find you, and you won't be able to escape them.